May 1945. The war in Europe had ended, but peace had not yet begun. A cold drizzle fell over the Bavarian countryside, turning the dirt roads into rivers of mud. Rows of women, wrapped in worn gray coats, stood in silence behind barbed wire. Their faces were pale, their eyes hollow from sleepless nights and endless uncertainty. These were former auxiliaries of the German army, secretaries, nurses, communication clerks, now prisoners under American control. The camp was quiet except for the distant rumble of trucks and the occasional command shouted in English. The women expected harsh treatment. They had heard rumors, confiscations, interrogations, humiliation. But what awaited them that morning was something they could not comprehend. An American officer walked down the line carrying a small wooden crate. One by one, he handed each woman a thin notebook and a pencil. "You may write," he said simply. For a moment, no one moved. Then one woman, young, her hands trembling, opened the notebook and saw the blank pages. Tears filled her eyes. She had not seen empty paper since the war began. The silence of the camp broke softly, the sound of pencils scratching against paper, echoing like the return of forgotten humanity. When Germany surrendered in May 1945, the world entered a strange, uneasy silence. The air still smelled of smoke and damp earth. Cities still smoldered, and millions of displaced people wandered through ruins searching for what was left of their lives. Among them were thousands of women, former auxiliaries, nurses, and clerks of the once mighty Third Reich. Many had served in the Wehrmacht or Luftwaffe support units. Others in administrative offices, hospitals, or supply depots. Some had believed in the cause. Others had simply followed orders or circumstance. But when the Reich collapsed, distinctions vanished. They were all now Kriegsgefangene, prisoners of war. The Allied forces faced an unprecedented challenge: what to do with the captured women of the defeated enemy. The Geneva Convention had not anticipated a war fought by entire populations, where civilians and soldiers blurred into one. In the West, the American occupation zone stretched across southern and central Germany, including Bavaria, Württemberg, and Hesse. The U.S. Army quickly set up hundreds of temporary camps, barbed wire enclosures built from former Wehrmacht sites, farm fields, or abandoned factories. Some held tens of thousands of prisoners. Others were small, improvised, little more than a few tents and a guard tower. The women who arrived at these camps carried little more than their identity tags and whatever they could salvage from the ruins. Many were in their early 20s, drafted or volunteered during the desperate final years of the war. They were not soldiers in the strict sense. They carried typewriters, not rifles. But to the Americans, they represented the bureaucratic machinery of the regime that had brought the world to its knees. The first weeks were filled with fear. Rumors spread like wildfire. The Soviets were brutal to prisoners. Would the Americans be any different? To the women's astonishment, the American guards maintained discipline but also restraint. They provided rations, often meager but consistent, and basic shelter. Medical units vaccinated the weak and treated frostbite and infections. It was not comfort, but it was survival. What struck many of the women most, however, was not the food or treatment. It was the strange leniency that followed. In June 1945, when camp commanders began distributing small notebooks and pencils to the female internees, confusion rippled through the compounds. To the Americans, it was a practical decision. Keeping the women occupied reduced anxiety, helped maintain order, and allowed them to document their identities. To the women, it felt almost unreal. Under the Nazi regime, writing one's thoughts had been a dangerous act. Diaries were suspected of disloyalty. Unsanctioned words could mean interrogation or punishment. Now suddenly their captors, the victors, were granting them permission to write freely. For the first time in years, they could think on paper. The Americans encouraged this quiet act not out of sentimentality but psychology. The U.S. Army had learned from its experiences in Italy and France that allowing prisoners to engage in structured, intellectual activity helped prevent unrest and despair. Writing, even in captivity, gave people purpose. For the German women, who had spent years under totalitarian control, it was both liberating and terrifying. Many hesitated at first, unsure what they were allowed to say. Would someone read their words? Would they be punished if they wrote something wrong? The guards simply told them, "It's yours." Within days, hundreds of pages began to fill with cramped handwriting. stories of hunger, fear, lost homes, and family members missing in the East. Some wrote of the bombings that had turned their cities to ash, others of the long marches through Allied lines, of nights spent in barns and cellars. A few wrote of guilt, the guilt of having believed even for a moment in Hitler's promises. Most, however, wrote simply to remember. One surviving diary from an American-run camp near Regensburg reads, "I do not know who I am anymore. Yesterday I was an officer's secretary. Today I am nothing. The Americans treat us correctly, almost kindly, and that is the hardest thing to bear. It breaks something inside. The gesture of being allowed to write reshaped the atmosphere of the camps. Conversations began again, quiet, cautious, human. The women read passages to one another, trading notebooks like lifelines. The act of writing became a form of therapy, though no one used that word at the time. To some, the notebook became a confessional. To others, it was the only connection left to their identity. Outside the wire, Germany was collapsing. Cities lay in ruins, industry destroyed, the railways shattered. Refugees streamed from the east, carrying what little remained of their world. The Allies launched massive denazification efforts, seeking to purge Germany of its ideological poison. Every person over the age of 18 had to complete a Fragebogen, a detailed questionnaire about their political affiliations. For the women in captivity, these notebooks often became their own private Fragebogen, a self-inquiry into what they had believed and why. The American officers in charge of the women's camps often came from varied backgrounds: teachers, lawyers, clerks drafted into service. They approached their duties differently than their counterparts in the Soviet zone. Where the Soviets relied on fear and labor, the Americans believed in structure and rehabilitation. Some historians later called this re-education, but at the time it was simply an experiment in restoring humanity to a broken people. The women, meanwhile, began to rebuild a semblance of normality. They organized small groups to clean, cook, and mend clothing. They sang old folk songs in the evenings, softly at first, afraid of punishment, but the guards never stopped them. On Sundays, the chaplains, sometimes American, sometimes German, held short services reading from worn Bibles found among the confiscated items. Life inside the wire settled into rhythm, yet for all the order, the psychological burden was immense. Many women wrestled with conflicting emotions, gratitude for humane treatment mixed with humiliation and shame. In their notebooks, these contradictions poured out. "I dreamed last night of home," wrote one nurse from Dusseldorf. "I woke and realized there is no home anymore. Perhaps only memory remains." American medical officers noticed the change. In their reports, they noted a visible improvement in morale after the diary policy began. Some women began sketching. Others translated English phrases, determined to understand the language of their captors. In one camp near Augsburg, a guard recalled seeing prisoners writing late into the night by candlelight, their faces illuminated by the soft glow of freedom rediscovered. This act, so small and administrative to the Americans, became a moral revolution for those women. In the midst of defeat and occupation, they were given a gift they had not known for years: the right to think, to feel, and to express. But beyond the barbed wire, not all Americans viewed this with sympathy. Some soldiers questioned the leniency. "They served the Reich," one sergeant wrote home. "Why should they be allowed comforts when so many of our boys are still buried overseas?" It was a valid question, one that haunted the Allied command. The line between justice and humanity was thin and constantly shifting. Yet higher officers defended the policy. "Mercy is not weakness," said one U.S. Army chaplain. "It is proof that we remain civilized even after all this." The American camps, though far from luxurious, became an unlikely stage for introspection. The women wrote about the war, about what they had seen and what they had refused to see. Some confessed that they had ignored the fate of Jewish neighbors, or believed the propaganda that promised victory long after defeat was inevitable. Others wrote bitterly about the men who had abandoned them, officers who fled, leaving secretaries and nurses to face the consequences alone. Slowly, these notebooks formed a mosaic of post-war emotion, fragments of guilt, despair, hope, and awakening. Historians who later uncovered some of these writings called them documents of quiet redemption. For the women who wrote them, they were not literature, they were survival. By late summer of 1945, the camp guards noticed a new kind of silence. Not the silence of fear, but the silence of thought. The sound of scratching pencils became as common as the clank of mess tins or the echo of roll call. Within those worn pages, the war was being processed, sentence by sentence, and as autumn arrived, a question began to form among both guards and prisoners alike. Could writing heal a nation as broken as Germany? The answer, in small, fragile ways, began to reveal itself in the days ahead. The deeper story of the women's diaries in American custody was not simply about paper and ink. It was about ideology meeting humanity, about people raised under absolute control suddenly encountering freedom in its quietest form. To understand how deeply this act shook them, one must step back and look at what these women had been molded into by the Nazi system. In the Germany of the 1930s, women were taught that their worth lay in loyalty and obedience. From classrooms to propaganda films, they heard the same refrain: Kinder, Küche, Kirche, children, kitchen, church. Even those who entered the armed services, the Wehrmachthelferinnen or Luftwaffenhelferinnen, were bound by hierarchy and silence. Their roles were vital: decoding, communications, medical assistance, yet their voices were not their own. Diaries, letters, or private reflections were discouraged, sometimes banned outright in military contexts. Secrecy was survival. Writing could be seen as betrayal. So when the war ended and the Americans placed notebooks in their hands, it wasn't merely an administrative gesture. It was, for many, the first time they were told that their thoughts had value. This psychological reversal was profound. They were captives, stripped of rank, status, and pride, yet suddenly entrusted with something forbidden: self-expression. The camp at Regensburg became one of the first to notice the difference. Lieutenant Harold Green, an American officer in charge of welfare operations, reported in a field memo that the allowance of diary keeping has reduced unrest and given prisoners a visible sense of calm. But beyond discipline, he saw something more subtle: the beginnings of introspection. In his notes, he wrote, "They are learning to think again, not as parts of a machine but as individuals." Among the German women, reactions varied. Some embraced the act, writing feverishly about everything: the bombings, the fear, the hunger. Others wrote with hesitation, their sentences rigid and impersonal as though still under watch. Over time, however, even these entries softened. The daily act of writing, one page, one thought at a time, became a private dialogue with guilt and grief. Many entries reveal an emotional landscape rarely acknowledged in post-war narratives. One woman, a former Red Cross nurse from Stuttgart, wrote that she could not sleep for weeks after arriving at the camp. "The quiet here is worse than the front," she confessed. "There I had a purpose. Here I have only my thoughts." Yet a month later her tone changed. "Today I helped the Americans distribute soup. They smiled at us. I felt something strange, a dignity." That word, dignity, appears again and again in the surviving diaries. It was something the war had taken from them, and something their captors paradoxically helped restore. To the American guards, this outcome was unexpected. The psychological division of the U.S. Army had long debated the question: could former enemy personnel be reformed through humane treatment? The re-education programs that followed, reading sessions, film screenings, structured discussions, all stemmed from these early experiments. The permission to write was their most organic form. It was not forced ideology, but internal reflection. One of the most striking observations came from Chaplain Robert White, stationed at a camp near Munich. In his journal, he described seeing a group of German women sitting together, notebooks open, heads bowed not in shame but in focus. "They write as if clinging to sanity," he wrote. "Perhaps they are writing their way back into humanity." There was something deeply symbolic in the setting. Around them lay a nation in ruins. American engineers were rebuilding bridges, clearing rubble, restoring order. Yet within the fences of the camps, something intangible was being rebuilt, a sense of conscience. Outside observers who later visited these camps were often stunned by the difference in atmosphere compared to Soviet or even British zones. The Americans allowed limited freedom within the boundaries of order, and the women responded with unexpected gratitude. This contrast was so sharp that some German civilians, when released, struggled to reconcile it with what propaganda had told them. The enemy, they discovered, was not cruel. He was human. The notebooks, though private, began to circulate in whispers. Some women read aloud sections to others who could not write. In one account, a former Luftwaffe telephone operator recited her diary to her group after evening roll call. She wrote about the day she learned Berlin had fallen. Her voice trembled as she described the image of burning rooftops and church spires collapsing. When she finished, the group was silent. Then, one by one, others began to share their own memories. It was a small, fragile act of communal healing, born from the simple permission to write. Historians later noted that many of these writings reflected an early shift in the German mindset, from denial to acknowledgement. Without knowing it, the women were documenting the emotional transition of a defeated people. They wrote of disillusionment with Hitler, of resentment toward male officers who had misled them, of quiet shame for what had been done in Germany's name. But they also wrote of hunger, longing, and small moments of kindness that defied hatred. For the Americans, these diaries became unofficial intelligence. Translators sometimes reviewed excerpts not to censor them, but to understand morale and ideology. They found to their surprise that the women's writings rarely contained hostility. Instead, they revealed exhaustion and sorrow. In an internal memo, one U.S. intelligence officer described them as a window into the German soul stripped of its uniform. There were tensions, of course. Not all guards were sympathetic. Some veterans of the front viewed their charges with contempt, remembering fallen comrades. "They get paper while my buddies got bullets," one corporal complained. Yet even he admitted after several weeks that, "These women aren't what I expected. They're just people trying to hold on." In this uneasy coexistence, small gestures carried enormous meaning. A guard sharing his coffee, a nurse thanking him in broken English, an American doctor asking a German prisoner to help organize supplies. Each act chipped away at years of indoctrinated fear. For women who had been told that Americans were monsters, the realization that they could be treated with fairness, even respect, was profoundly destabilizing. The notebooks became more than records. They became symbols of contradiction. Inside them, the women began to confront truths they had buried. Some wrote of Jews they had seen marched away, of the silence that had followed. Others admitted they had believed the war would bring a better world. Now they saw only ashes. "We were told we were chosen," one wrote. But chosen for what? To destroy ourselves? For the Americans, allowing this introspection was not only moral but strategic. The U.S. Army understood that lasting peace required more than victory. It required transformation. The goal was not humiliation but reorientation. The diaries were a quiet step in that process. They allowed the defeated to rebuild from within, one sentence at a time. Yet the act also raised ethical questions. Was this self-reflection genuine remorse or merely self-pity? Could those who had served a tyrannical system truly reform through kindness? The Americans themselves debated these points. Some argued that leniency bred amnesia. Others believed that only compassion could break the cycle of hate. In hindsight, both were partially right. What is certain is that the diary policy created ripples beyond the wire. When some of the women were released, they carried their notebooks with them, hidden in their few belongings. Decades later, historians and journalists uncovered fragments of these writings in archives, private collections, and museums. Many were unsigned, the authors long gone. But their words remain among the most intimate testimonies of post-war Germany. Not political, not military, but human. One such diary, discovered in 1987 in a Munich attic, contained the line, "The Americans gave us food, shelter, and something more dangerous, and freedom to think. I do not know if I deserve it." That sentence captures the moral paradox of the time. Freedom, after years of servitude, felt almost unbearable. By late 1945, as the Allied occupation solidified and reconstruction began, the camps slowly emptied. Many of the women returned to cities that no longer existed. Some became translators for American units, others nurses in rebuilding hospitals. A few emigrated, seeking new lives far from the shadows of war. But those who kept their diaries carried with them a piece of transformation, a record of how mercy could unsettle as deeply as violence. Inside those pages lay the story of a nation's conscience beginning to stir again. The pens that once obeyed orders now wrote truth. The hands that had typed military reports now wrote of grief and guilt. And for the first time in a decade, words, not propaganda, not command, became a means of liberation. In that quiet act, the power dynamic of war began to reverse. The captor had given the prisoner the tool of introspection, and the prisoner, in turn, had rediscovered the meaning of being human. And it was precisely in that fragile rediscovery that the most profound turning point was about to emerge, not in the battlefield, but in the minds of those who once served the losing side. The turning point came not in an explosion nor in a courtroom, but in silence. In late 1945, in a former Luftwaffe compound near Heidelberg, the U.S. Army converted a medical facility into a rehabilitation and processing center for female prisoners of war. The structure had been built with military precision, long corridors, whitewashed walls, and narrow windows that let in the pale light of a defeated Germany. But inside, something new was unfolding, an experiment in humanity. The American officers who oversaw the center were not combat men. Many were doctors, psychologists, and chaplains from the Allied Control Council, part of the growing effort to denazify and reintegrate captured personnel. Among their new arrivals were over 100 German nurses and administrative aides, women who had once served in field hospitals, Luftwaffe communications units, and SS medical branches. They arrived weary, hollow-eyed, clutching their few possessions wrapped in cloth or stored in worn satchels. Most had expected harsh treatment, perhaps even retribution. Instead, they were greeted by calm American orderlies and told they would assist in tending to wounded prisoners of all nationalities, including Americans. The shock was visible. These women, conditioned to view the Allied soldier as a merciless invader, now found themselves washing his wounds, changing his bandages, or fetching water under the supervision of American doctors. Their fear was palpable at first. Some refused to make eye contact. Others trembled when spoken to. Yet as the days passed, something unfamiliar began to replace that fear: disbelief. The Americans treated them not as enemies, but as professionals. They were given tasks, not punishments. Their skill, not their allegiance, was acknowledged. One U.S. medical officer, Captain Robert Ellsworth, later wrote in his post-war report, "Their faces bore the look of discipline cracked by exhaustion. But when handed surgical instruments, the transformation was immediate. Their hands remembered purpose." He described a moment when a German nurse, perhaps in her 20s, hesitated before entering an operating room. Ellsworth simply handed her a mask and said, "You're needed." She obeyed, not because of an order, but because of instinct. That single act became symbolic of what the Americans were trying to achieve: to make their captives participants in restoration rather than relics of destruction. But with this cooperation came a wave of emotional reckoning. The first time the women were allowed to assist in surgery alongside Americans, many broke down afterward. For some, the shock of equality was unbearable. They had lived in a system where hierarchy defined every breath: male above female, German above foreigner, superior above subordinate. Now, in that cold operating room, all were reduced to the same essential human struggle: saving a life. The American doctors, though professional, were not oblivious to the emotional weight of what was happening. In one diary entry, a nurse wrote of assisting in the operation of a wounded Polish prisoner. She described how her hands shook when she realized the man she was helping belonged to a group her nation had once dehumanized. "For years we were told they were animals," she wrote, "but when he cried out, he sounded like my brother." Moments like this spread quietly through the camp. There were no speeches, no official declarations, only the slow erosion of ideology through contact with reality. In the cafeteria, German nurses shared benches with American and Allied personnel. They watched men and women in uniform, both genders, eating together, laughing, discussing medicine, science, the weather. To many of the Germans, this was perhaps the most shocking revelation of all. In their world, such equality had been unthinkable. The idea that women could stand beside men in command, speak openly, and be respected for their intelligence was revolutionary. One report from the Heidelberg facility noted an incident that captured this change vividly. A German matron, formerly an SS hospital administrator, was assisting in a routine debridement procedure under an American major named Helen Crawford, one of the few female surgeons attached to the U.S. Army Medical Corps. When the operation concluded, Crawford thanked her directly, addressing her as nurse, not prisoner. The German woman froze. Later she wept in her quarters, saying to another nurse, She thanked me as if I were her equal. That small moment, a woman from the victorious side showing respect to a woman from the defeated, carried more weight than any political speech. It was the human heart reasserting itself after years of indoctrination. Outside the compound, Germany was collapsing under the winter of 1945. Cities lay in ruins, bridges mangled, railways twisted by bombings. Yet within the camp's walls an invisible reconstruction had begun. The American doctors encouraged their German assistants to write daily reflections, part therapy, part record. Some wrote of their guilt, others wrote of astonishment. "We were raised to believe Americans would laugh as they crushed us," one wrote. Instead, they asked for our help. The relationship was not free of tension. Some American guards resented the compassion shown to former enemies. They questioned why women who had served the Reich should be allowed the privilege of collaboration. Yet even among skeptics, the results were undeniable. Morale improved, discipline stabilized, and a fragile trust took root. For many American officers, this experiment proved that reformation was possible through shared purpose, through work, dignity, and respect. But the emotional weight was heaviest on the German side. Some women broke under the pressure of internal conflict, gratitude toward their captors colliding with guilt for their past. The diary of one nurse recorded a haunting confession. "Every time they call me sister, I feel unworthy. I remember the patients we refused because they were not Aryan. Now I dress the wounds of those our regime would have let die." These were not abstract realizations. They were lived confrontations with the moral wreckage of their nation. A particularly powerful episode unfolded in February 1946. During a night shift, an American medic was rushed into surgery after an accident involving transport vehicles. The available German nurses immediately offered assistance. They worked tirelessly under Major Crawford's command, sterilizing tools, managing blood transfusions, keeping the patient stable. When the soldier survived, Crawford thanked them publicly, noting that they saved one of ours. It was not a statement of propaganda, it was fact. The German nurses wept. One later wrote, "In that room I ceased being a prisoner. I was simply a nurse again." The turning point for the Americans, too, was profound. They began to see these women not as defeated enemies, but as victims of a system that had devoured its own. Some doctors remarked that they could no longer imagine running the facility without them. "They are the backbone of this place," one officer wrote. "If this is what Germany will become, disciplined, remorseful, humane, then perhaps there is hope." Word of the cooperation spread quietly among other camps. Military correspondents visiting Heidelberg described it as an unlikely oasis. Reporters noted how German women worked alongside American personnel, treating wounded men from both sides without distinction. It was, as one observer put it, a picture of what peace might look like, if only the world could learn from it. For the German nurses, these experiences left deep emotional scars, not from cruelty but from kindness. Kindness, after years of ideological hatred, was disorienting. It forced them to reevaluate everything they had believed about the world. "When the Americans let me touch their instruments," one wrote, "it was as if they trusted me more than my own officers ever did." This was not sentimentality. It was psychological reawakening. The cumulative impact of these experiences formed the moral climax of their captivity. What began as fear and humiliation became introspection, and eventually fragile redemption. They learned that power could exist without brutality, that command could coexist with compassion. For many, this discovery was more transformative than liberation itself. When the first group of nurses was released later that year, the Americans held a small ceremony, informal, without flags or fanfare. Captain Ellsworth simply addressed them as colleagues. He told them that the war was over, but their work, healing, must continue. Several of the women cried openly. One stepped forward and saluted, not out of compulsion but respect. The diaries they carried home told of this transformation with striking clarity. "The Americans showed us what strength truly is," one entry read. "It is not the power to destroy. It is the grace to rebuild." That sentence encapsulated the entire emotional journey, from fear to gratitude, from ideology to humanity. And yet, even as they left the camp, a haunting awareness remained. Many wondered how they could explain this experience to those outside. To their families still suffering amid the ruins, to men embittered by loss, to communities still clinging to pride, how could they describe compassion from the enemy? Some chose silence. Others, years later, spoke of it in hushed tones, describing it as the moment they realized the world was larger than the Reich had allowed them to imagine. That realization, that humanity could transcend propaganda, became the quiet legacy of these encounters. It was the true turning point, not of battle, but of conscience. The war had ended months earlier on paper, but here in these makeshift hospitals and converted camps, it was still ending in the human heart. When the first spring after Germany's surrender arrived, the world outside the fences of the Heidelberg facility was unrecognizable. Entire cities lay in skeletal ruin. Smoke still drifted from the shells of factories that had once symbolized German might. The air smelled of damp earth and burnt brick. In those months, the concept of rebuilding seemed almost impossible, a fantasy spoken by foreign occupiers and idealists. Yet within the American-controlled rehabilitation centers, a different kind of reconstruction had already begun, one that would not be recorded in the architectural blueprints of post-war Germany, but in the quiet moral repair of its people. The German nurses who had assisted American medical officers returned to a nation that barely resembled the one they had served. Many came home to towns flattened by bombings, families scattered or dead, and a population struggling to survive in what became known as the Trümmerzeit, the time of the rubble. They had expected to be shunned or interrogated for their role in the war. Instead, many found themselves too insignificant to notice. The country was busy surviving, scrounging for food, shelter, and dignity amid the wreckage. But for these women, their months under American custody had already changed something deep within them, a shift in how they viewed authority, work, and even themselves. Several of them resumed nursing, not under military command, but in makeshift hospitals run by Allied and German relief organizations. Their behavior surprised observers. They were disciplined yet gentle, authoritative yet humble. American officers visiting the new clinics noted how these women insisted that all patients, German, Allied, civilian, be treated equally. One U.S. Red Cross report from late 1946 stated that former Eintas POW nurses displayed a striking sense of democratic cooperation uncommon in earlier German systems. This was the subtle but profound influence of their experience under American medical supervision. For many, the small acts of dignity they had received in captivity, the right to write in a diary, to assist in surgery, to be addressed as a professional, became the foundation of their new moral compass. They taught younger nurses compassion through structure, precision through empathy, and though they rarely spoke of it, the memory of being treated as equals by Americans, including women in uniform, lingered. It became a quiet rebellion against the patriarchal obedience that had defined their wartime existence. The Allied authorities soon recognized the importance of such transformations. In 1947, several rehabilitation reports highlighted the role of female POWs in post-war medical rebuilding. The Americans understood that the reconstruction of Germany would not succeed through punishment alone. It required new models of responsibility and cooperation. The presence of women who had seen humanity from both sides of the barbed wire served as living proof that reformation was possible. These women, once part of a defeated army, became the moral nurses of a wounded nation. Yet not all accepted this new outlook. Many of the women faced suspicion when they spoke about their treatment. Some of their compatriots accused them of being softened by the victors. In conservative German communities, their stories of respect from American men and collaboration with American women clashed with traditional values and the bitterness of defeat. A few nurses chose silence, locking away their diaries for decades. Others left Germany altogether, joining humanitarian organizations or emigrating to rebuild their lives elsewhere. But among those who stayed, the effects were long-lasting. The empathy they had learned, that moral endurance in the face of kindness, became part of Germany's post-war nursing ethos. Hospitals reopened with mixed staffs, often including Allied personnel, where hierarchical barriers were replaced by cooperation. Female leadership in medicine quietly expanded, inspired not by ideology but by necessity and shared experience. The American officers, too, carried memories of the experiment in Heidelberg. Some wrote about it in post-war journals and medical archives, describing it as a study in the re-education of conscience. The American military had long believed that moral rehabilitation could not be enforced by lectures or propaganda. It had to be lived. The cooperation with German women in wartime medicine became a case study in practical ethics, one later used in post-conflict humanitarian training for future U.S. Army Medical Corps. The long-term psychological impact on the German nurses, however, was complex. Many struggled with survivor's guilt, not only for having survived when millions perished, but for being shown compassion by those they had been taught to hate. Diaries recovered decades later revealed deep inner turmoil. Why did they trust us? One wrote in 1947. We were the defeated, the guilty. Yet they gave us instruments, patience, respect. It broke something inside and healed something else. Their words echo the paradox of post-war redemption, the realization that moral repair often begins with the pain of undeserved grace. These women had expected justice in the form of humiliation or imprisonment. Instead, they found it in shared labor, in the slow and painful act of helping the wounded regardless of uniform. In doing so, they confronted the human cost of the ideology they had once served. By the late 1940s, some of the former POW nurses began corresponding with their American counterparts. Letters exchanged between Heidelberg and Chicago, or between Frankfurt and New York, carried fragments of gratitude, curiosity, and reflection. One letter preserved in the U.S. Army Medical Archives reads simply, "You allowed us to see that the world is not divided into victors and vanquished, but into those who destroy and those who heal." These exchanges rarely made it into official records, yet they represented the true continuation of the Allied vision for a re-educated Germany, not through coercion, but through human example. As Germany began to rebuild, its medical institutions played a central role in shaping the country's new identity. Female participation expanded steadily, driven in part by the shortage of men and the demonstrated competence of women during and after the war. But beneath the statistics lay something less visible, the lingering moral echo of Heidelberg. The idea that dignity, once granted even in captivity, could reshape a person's entire sense of purpose. For the American doctors who had led the rehabilitation program, the experience marked one of the few moments in which war gave way to empathy. Major Helen Crawford, one of the pioneering female surgeons involved, later stated in a post-war interview, "Those women learned medicine in a dictatorship and practiced it in democracy. We taught them surgery, but they taught us endurance." Crawford's words summarized a truth that transcended sides, that compassion, when extended across the boundaries of enmity, leaves neither party unchanged. By the early 1950s, several of the German nurses had become part of the country's first generation of post-war health educators. Their methods emphasized precision, discipline, and humanity, a blend that would later define West Germany's nursing reputation. Though the Allied administration rarely credited these women directly, their influence ran deep through the system they helped rebuild. Many trained under Red Cross initiatives, some even traveling to the United States under educational exchange programs funded by the Marshall Plan. In personal accounts, they rarely glorified the Americans, nor did they absolve themselves of guilt. What they remembered instead were moments, small, ordinary, almost sacred in their simplicity. The sound of an American doctor's calm voice in the operating room, the feeling of wearing clean gloves after months of scarcity, the trust placed in their hands when they were told to assist, not because of allegiance but because of ability. These fragments became the quiet architecture of their post-war identity. Some years later, historians and journalists rediscovered these diaries in archives and family collections. What emerged was not a story of propaganda or defiance, but of moral awakening. The tone of these writings was often restrained, almost clinical. Yet between the lines there was grief, humility, and transformation. "They broke us without cruelty," one nurse wrote, "and by breaking us they showed us what it meant to be whole again." This transformation rippled far beyond the medical wards. In post-war Germany's emerging democratic culture, the concept of Mitmenschlichkeit, compassion toward one's fellow human, became a cornerstone of national ethics. It was not born from political theory, but from experiences like those in Heidelberg, where acts of humanity replaced vengeance. In time, the nurses' experiences came to symbolize something larger, the possibility of moral re-education through shared labor and respect. When Germany re-entered the international community in the 1950s, these lessons became part of its cultural DNA, invisible but vital, like a healed scar. Even decades later, when some of the surviving women were interviewed in their old age, the memories still carried a tremor of disbelief. "I never thought kindness could hurt so much," one said. "It made me realize how wrong we had been, not just in war but in spirit." The aftermath of their captivity did not end with their release. It continued in every act of care, every patient they treated, every young nurse they trained to value life without distinction. Through them, the legacy of those American doctors, and the silent moral revolution that unfolded behind barbed wire, endured long after the war had faded from memory. Years later, when the last of those women were gray-haired and frail, their diaries became artifacts of quiet revolution. Bound in brittle leather, ink faded, they revealed not defiance but rebirth, the slow awakening of conscience in a world once blind to it. No monuments were built for them, no medals awarded, yet in their silence they left something far greater, the proof that compassion can survive captivity, and that dignity can exist even when freedom is taken away. What those American doctors and guards had offered was more than leniency. It was a mirror held up to the defeated, forcing them to see their own humanity reflected in the faces of their former enemies. That simple permission, to write, to think, to heal, was an act of trust that disarmed far more effectively than punishment ever could. It was a lesson that strength is not measured in dominance but in restraint. In every page of those diaries, one can sense the fragile balance between guilt and gratitude, between what was lost and what was rediscovered. They wrote not to justify themselves, but to remember that even in ruins one could still be human. The Americans, without knowing it, had redefined what victory meant, not the destruction of a people, but their restoration through grace. History often remembers the bombs, the battles, and the borders redrawn. But the real victory of 1945 was quieter, found in the moments when compassion crossed the wire, when a notebook replaced a weapon, and when an enemy was allowed to feel again. For in those camps where pencils met paper and wounds met healing hands, humanity itself was rewritten, not in the speeches of generals, but in the trembling handwriting of women who had once believed they had none.